Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute's very first virtual Advances in Melanoma Cancer Care Survivorship event. My name is Katie Falinger, and some of you may remember me from CBS 3, where I was the morning meteorologist for a number of years. These days, I am working on a lot of other projects, including doing events like this. I published my first book over the summer. I'm a public speaker, and I also help burgeoning video creators effectively create their own content. I would also be remiss if I did not mention that I am also the extremely proud mom of 5-year-old twin girls, and hopefully you won't hear too much of them in the background throughout this event. So this event is typically held, as many of you know, every May in recognition of Melanoma Skin Cancer Awareness Month. And we were so disappointed to have to cancel last year as a COVID safety precaution. So we hope you're all staying safe and healthy during these times. And although this survivorship event is certainly looking a little different this year in a virtual format, our program is going to be just as informative as it always is. And I'd like to start off by thanking our sponsor for this event, NJM Insurance Group. NJM offers personal and business insurance and are devoted to helping people with a commitment to customer satisfaction. We really appreciate their support of this exciting and very important event. Very quickly, I do want to go over just some general housekeeping rules and on how to navigate WebEx in case you're unfamiliar. I do want to let you know that all participants have been muted with your video cameras off upon entry to the event. This is a way to eliminate feedback and distractions throughout the program. But that said, we do still want you to participate. So we encourage you to welcome and greet one another in the chat box. You can send to everyone on those greetings. And we also welcome and encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. So the way that is going to work in this format, if you have a question, you can use the chat feature that, again, it's located on the right side of your screen, and you'll select the option to send your question to all panelists. And this way they'll be sent only to me and our speakers this evening, and that will ensure confidentiality for other attendees, but it also ensures that your question doesn't get lost into the public chat. We do want to address as many of your questions as we can. So again, if you've got a question, be sure to select to send it to all panelists. And just one other note regarding your questions, try to submit them during the presentations, since each speaker is going to be addressing your questions right after his or her presentation. So type those in as you think of them, okay? Also, this program is being recorded, and we are going to make it available to you to watch again at a later time, so you'll be able to review everything once more. And just one last ask that we have of you: when you exit the event at the conclusion of this program, a survey is going to pop up, and we just ask that you would please take a few minutes to complete that. We really value your feedback, and we always use it when we're planning future events. So we'd so appreciate if you would take the time to do that. Okay, I see people are continuing to come in, which is fantastic. That is going to do it for our housekeeping notes, and we've got a great agenda for you planned this evening. First, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Suresh Nair, medical oncologist and physician-in-chief at Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute, likely a very familiar face for so many of you. He's going to provide us with a quick update on advances in melanoma cancer care and survivorship right here at Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute. We'll also hear from, or after Dr. Nair's remarks, we're also going to hear a presentation from Dr. Alexander Shushari. He's medical oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And then we'll open up the floor for some questions. And then we'll also hear from Mariah Valet. She is a melanoma survivor, and she received her treatment and care at Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute. And then we'll once more open up the floor to your questions. So we really hope you enjoyed the program. We're really looking forward to hearing your questions as well. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Nair. Dr. Nair?
Thank you, Katie. This is a really exciting evening, and welcome to all the melanoma survivors and families, and also the staff as we celebrate May and melanoma survivorship. I'm a medical oncologist who specialized in melanoma treatment and care for 31 years. My first 14 years, I was at Geisinger Clinic, and the last 17 years here at the Lehigh Valley Health Network. And my training in melanoma goes back to University of Pittsburgh, which in the 80s and 90s specialized in a old school immunotherapy called interleukin-2. When I moved here from Geisinger in 2004, we did start a high-dose IL-2 unit. We treated about 90 patients from 2004 to 2017. And in that time period, 2004 till about 2012 or so, it was really the only realistic hope for cure of stage 4 melanoma. But the percentages were low, just to show the difference. Back then, we treated about 50 stage 4 melanomas and we cured 5. We did have others that lived much longer than what was expected at the time because chemotherapy was not very helpful at all in melanoma as far as survival. So today, just to show how far we've come since 2012 or so, we have about 75 melanoma survivors of stage 4 that I'm caring for, over 100 stage 3, and many more also with some of my other associates in the program. And so we have a lot to celebrate. We know that our original 5-IL-2 patients truly are cured because some of our survivors are out 17 years from stage 4. But in 2014, we started this survivor celebration program. That's when Rebecca and Richard, who've told their stories to this group, have been featured in the press as well, were in the original phase 2 testing of nivolumab, which is also called Opdivo, and ipilimumab, which is called Yervoy. And so that was a BMS 064 trial. 2 of our 4 patients in that trial have gone on to be considered very likely cured. They're 7 and 8 years out, and we're celebrating them. But since then, we had BMS 067, which established ipi-nivo combination checkpoint as the best treatment in 2014. And that's led to many long-term remissions leading to potentially cures. And following that, we've worked with Dr. Blackham, Aaron Blackham, our surgical oncologist, brought in TVEC as a immunotherapy. And that also, especially when combined with some of the checkpoint immunotherapy drugs like Ipi or pembrolizumab, led to some long-term disease-free survival, which we think are going to be leading to cures. And then the stage 3 impact of these medicines were proven by several clinical trials many of our survivors participated in, which essentially improved the curability of stage 3 melanoma. And so we have a lot to celebrate. The other major progress has been, and we have a superb guest speaker today, Dr. Alex Shustari, who's one of the young stars of the melanoma team at Sloan Kettering. We've had a wonderful partnership with the Sloan Melanoma Program. We're now starting year 6 of our partnership with Memorial Sloan Kettering. But the melanoma team and our program have been joined at the hip for a long time. Dr. Jed Wolchuk and I have collaborated going on almost 20 years. And Dr. Maggie Callahan, Dr. Mike Postow, Dr. Alex Shustari, and many others from the group, Dr. Chapman, we all collaborate. And I'd like to acknowledge our melanoma team here. Dr. Blackham is our surgical oncologist. Dr. Chetnayak is our head and neck melanoma specialist, surgical specialist. We have Dr. Allison McIntosh as our radiation oncology specialist. I take care of the medical oncology. I have several other younger colleagues working with me as well. And Angela Miller is our awesome melanoma navigator. And in the office, medical oncology office, we have Lauren Denberger, who patients call Sunshine, and also Rachel Okafor, my oncology nurse. So we have a lot to celebrate. I welcome everybody. I know it's a very exciting day. Feel free to use the chat box, which is Katie said, in the to celebrate each other and celebrate survivorship. I can't wait until we get to a live event. We had aspirations of going to Bear Creek so that we can all potentially be outside and celebrate next year. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nair, for those remarks. And we are going to continue on now in our program. And up next, I would like to welcome Dr. Alexander Shustari, who is medical oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Welcome, Dr. Shustari. Take it away.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I'm actually presenting from clinic, so just finishing up the clinic day, and I'm sorry I was a few minutes late in joining, but hopefully you guys can hear me okay. And I have prepared a a traditional PowerPoint deck for you guys. Hopefully it's not too boring. Dr. Nair and I, as you mentioned, we collaborate quite a bit, and this is actually gonna talk about immunotherapy and the genomics piece, which is, I think, just one part of us understanding why some people do well and some people are still not doing so well. And you guys, hopefully will get something out of it. And this is a paper. A lot of this stuff is just recently published. Dr. Nair is on the manuscript as a true collaborator and wouldn't be able to corral quite as many patients without him. And it's just a fantastic pleasure for me to be able to present this to you. So I think the most relevant disclosure to keep in mind is, like many people, I advise for Bristol Myers Squibb, and a lot of the checkpoint inhibitor stuff is made by them. So I always want to make sure I address that. And then the other thing, this is a Benjamin Franklin quote that I love. This was his quote when he described electricity to the Royal College of London. Of course, I'm not describing anything quite so world-changing, but I think within our little melanoma community, I do think it's a little bolt of insight, if you will. And so I apologize for making this talk probably a little too long, because I probably should have spent much more time to make it just a little bit shorter, and I apologize for that, but hopefully you get something out of it. So thank you to the folks that did most of the work. I mentioned Dr. Nair. Nikki Schultz is our bioinformatician, and his lab was just fantastic. Our statistics group, you'll see shortly why they were so important. So here, I wanted to sort of, take a broad overview, and then I'll return back to sort of a more traditional outline, a sort of a better way to think about this outline. But in sort of, as an oncologist, thinking we have a certain driver system in cutaneous melanoma, in the most common subtype of melanomas, and you guys all know about BRAF mutations and what it means to have that mutation. But there are a lot of other mutations that I don't think get discussed as often. And our question was, there used to be a sort of 3-group system. Can we make that system better? And does it even matter understanding the mutations in melanomas when all you're going to do for a lot of people is give them immunotherapy? How often does it help to know genetic information from melanomas when PD-1 blockade doesn't work, when the backbone of immunotherapy doesn't work, and where do we go next? So this is the Cancer Genome Atlas. This is the key figure from a big collaboration from several, not quite a decade ago, but almost a decade ago. And this was where a lot of people sent in, from a few institutions, sent in their melanomas back when genomic sequencing was very, very expensive and difficult to do. And this, generated statistics that we still quote sometimes to patients, and definitely quote to other clinicians when we talk about melanoma. And the idea was half of melanomas, so each melanoma is actually a column here, and the genes are listed. You can barely see them, but the genes are listed on the right-hand side. You can ignore most of the rest of this. And half of melanomas had a BRAF mutation, most of which were in a location called V600, and that was the blue here. The RAS family, NRAS mostly, was another gene that was about a quarter of cases, and then NF1 was the third group in this case, but it overlapped with a few other genes, and this has been a recurring problem in melanoma genetics. We look at these genes because they all feed into kind of one growth pathway that we call the MAP kinase pathway. And we think of them as individual sort of genes, and if you activate one, it's turning on the pathway, and that's all you need. But as you can see, multiple genes can be mutated in the same melanoma. And furthermore, they couldn't really find any sort of activating switch in the genes for about 1 in 7 melanomas. So the main questions in our minds and in the course of the whole field, I would say, is it really 1 in 7 that don't have a driver? What do you do when you have more than one mutation? How does that work? And as I said, does it matter in the immunotherapy era? Do you ever actually target the genes, the gene products or the gene mutations with medicines, or is it just a lot of intellectual information that the average person doesn't really need to know when they're in the melanoma clinic? And hopefully I can advance the slide. Okay, so this is where a tool, they asked me to sort of highlight something that, I think we do pretty well at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And one of them is sort of looking at a panel of multiple genes. And it's sort of like a lot of other things, when you have sort of strength in numbers, and you're going to use the same kind of test for multiple people with different types of cancer, it's now increasingly in vogue to use panels that have a large amount of genes. And so we started back in 2012, believe it or not, doing this. And now there's multiple, companies that do this. I don't get any money from any of them, so I'm happy to tell you, Foundation Medicine, there's our test, MSK-IMPACT, there's Tempest that does it, Caris, there's a bunch. And what we like about ours and a lot of these others is it doesn't look at every single gene, but we handpicked, several hundred that would be relevant for breast cancer and colon cancer and melanoma and lymphoma and everything else. But it's not going to be too broad. And then you can look very, very deeply, much more deeply at a few genes, a few hundred genes, than the Cancer Genome Atlas did 10 years ago, where they did all the genes in the exome, which is about 20,000, but they couldn't look as deeply. And you sometimes find things that you would otherwise miss when you look super deeply. It's just like anything else. When you're proofreading a manuscript and you look very, very carefully, you go very, very slowly, you catch errors that you might have missed when you were just kind of skimming the whole thing. And so what we know already when we went into this project, and what many of you know firsthand, is that PD-1 and CTLA-4 blockade, which I will just kind of refer to as either PD-1 based therapy or immunotherapy, helps more than half of people with stage 4 cutaneous melanoma live more than 5 years. Now, that's exciting because of where it used to be, but we're by no means, resting on our laurels. And to us, that means that tons of people, and I know at least one loved one, I think, in the audience, tons of people have lost people still with stage 4 melanoma. How can we improve that? Well, we know that more mutations in your melanoma was good for your chances and what's the so-called tumor mutational burden, or TMB. So more mutations was a better thing. And we also know, my colleague Allison Batoff-Werner, Dr. Batoff-Werner has published that, people with complete responses at our institution, and other people have described this, people with complete responses, their scans look good at some point. Whenever you get to that point, you can really start to exhale a little bit and start to plan ahead, because there's a very good chance that you will be in control of your melanoma for years to come. And I think the big question is, of course, how many years to come? We don't really know that yet, but I think we'll know that as time progresses. So our question was, and this is the framework I'll use for the next few minutes, how useful is all this fancy genetics? So what do we do when there's a report that comes back from MSK-IMPACT or any other any other company that has a bunch of mutations? Does knowing the mutations matter for immunotherapy, and how often do we use that information to target these so-called drivers of that MAP kinase pathway, other than the low-hanging fruit, the BRAF V600, which I won't talk quite as much about today, because that's already kind of been established. That's the first one that really defined all of this. And so I keep hitting the wrong button. So this is the first part. What do we do when the report has a bunch of mutations? So we started with a whole bunch of patients, and we really, went down to what is a size group that was double the size of the prior largest group that had been assembled before. So it's over double the size of the Cancer Genome Atlas, and so I think we were very proud of that. We sort of look at things like the drivers, the mutational burden that I mentioned, and then we worked hard to kind of understand who the patients were, how they did the treatments. We really tried to focus in on that because some of these other collaborations from multiple institutions, you can't get that detailed about clinical information. It just takes too much sweat equity. And so I was happy to put forth that sweat equity. And then we looked at about 300 patients, a little over 300 patients that got immunotherapy. That's the second part of it. So out of the first 696 patients, I'll skip this except to say that the tumors were from, we used a lot of lymph node metastases, some, lung or even brain metastases. The primary site, so where did the melanoma start, was all over the body, as you would expect. And some of them had no known primary, which I'll get to as well. And so here is the same version of the OncoPrint, the gene mutation list that the TCGA is that I showed you, where it showed BRAF as sort of the first group. And what we've found, and I'll show you why, was that it's better to think of actually not NRAS first, but to first isolate out the BRAF mutations. You see that those don't really have a lot of other mutations. Each color is sort of a different mutational change. And so this light blue and this green have relatively few other mutations in this pathway. And if you notice, there's a lot more genes in the pathway. And that's, I think, the beauty of having a targeted panel where we look really deeply at about 28 genes here. So these don't have very many other mutations. When you look at NF1, which is in the other group, the TCGA called it its own group. We agree, we think it's its own group, but the NF1 has a ton of other mutations in it, and we decided to call any NF1 mutant 1 an NF1 mutant melanoma, even if it had a separate BRAF mutation, a non-V600 mutation. Then we put NRAS third in the hierarchy. So if you had an NRAS and an NF1, you were an NF1. But if you were an NRAS and anything else, we put you in a separate category. And then we saw differences, which I won't spend too much time. I think it's a little too detailed here. We saw differences in other RAS genes that were mutated versus the most common one, which is called NRAS Q61. So we actually separated those out, and I think there's a good reason for that. And so we made 9 distinct categories that you can see in the various colored bands. And I'll show you a lot of this other information in other slides in a better way. So I won't spend too much other time except to say we made, instead of 3 groups and triple wild type, the old 4-group classification, we actually showed that, there's probably at least 9 groups. So we can almost always find a genetic mutation. And that's all you need to take away from this slide. I'll just move past it. But instead of having 14% with no known MAP kinase driver, we got that number down quite a bit to only 4%. So we're confident that we're just finding a few more other drivers. And at the end, I'll tell you why we think that's occasionally very important. So this will be, an example of a mutated melanoma. It's got 88 mutations, which is quite a bit. The tumor mutational burden is extraordinarily high here. And so you'd say, well, there's NRAS here, that's G12C. There's a BRAF mutation that most clinicians have never heard of. There's an NF1 mutation. You say, okay, this is hard. I'm going to give this person immunotherapy. But I think there's a lot of sort of hidden information here, and we wanted to organize it in a way that a clinician like Dr. Nair or myself could look at this and sort of make some heads or tails, and most importantly, convey that information to the patient and say, you know, am I optimistic? Am I pessimistic about our immunotherapy chances, and why is that? So what we found here was that I mentioned that the BRAF B600 mutations were rarely mutated with anything else, whereas the NF1s, for example, were often mutated with other things. And so this was the example. This is a way to plot that. So on the y-axis here, the more common a gene is, the higher up on the chart it is. So these are the most common ones. And then the less common ones are all the way at the bottom. And then on the x-axis to the left or right, the ones on the left show how often or not often they're altered with something else. So that's why BRAF V600E was very common and almost never altered with anything else, whereas NF1 is almost as common in our group, and about 70% of the time had one of these other mutations along with it. And so right away, a clinician can look at this and say, I'm not going to, you know, get too confused if I see a KIT mutation and there's a bunch of other mutations. That's pretty common. It's less common to have a BRAF V600E with something else. And I actually think that's sort of important. So this again were the 9 groups. I'm going to sort of jump past it. I think it's a little bit too detailed for our discussions, and I'll come back to some of these rare drivers at the end. I'll show you some nice scans. So again, that's to reintroduce kind of what I just showed you, to say, again, certain genes, when you find them, they seem to be enough to cause the melanoma without few other mutations, and BRAF V600 is the poster child for that. NF1 seems to need multiple genetic hits in the same pathway to turn into a melanoma, that we sequence a melanoma in a patient that needs help. And then NRAS Q61 was probably in the middle, so it was sometimes altered, but not quite as often. So what do we do when, you know, I hope I sort of showed you when a report has a bunch of mutations on it, we've kind of made a hierarchy to try to have the clinicians kind of make sense of that and be able to sort of understand it a little bit better. Now, okay, that's all well and good, pretty graphs. I'm not sure I grabbed all of it, Shushtari. Why do I really need to know, especially if I'm going to get immunotherapy? And that's where I think, you know, we were excited, because when we were staring at these reports over and over, we noticed that certain genetics, you know, had more mutations, and certain genetic drivers had fewer mutations. So we made sort of a complicated chart here that I'll walk you through. So here we put the 9 groups that I showed you. And so this is the most common one, BRAF V600E, for example. And we plotted them based on where the melanoma was when it started. On you know, the person said, hey, I had a spot taken out on my scalp, or you had it on your trunk or your leg. Or sometimes you get a melanoma diagnosis and the first you hear of it is when it's in a lymph node or even sometimes another organ. And you say, oh my God, I never even knew I had melanoma. And that's called an unknown primary. So we divided those out across the rows and said by each site, from the head, arms, trunk, legs, and unknown, are there certain genetic drivers that are more common in certain types? And I actually use this clinically as a clinician. When someone walks in, if I were waiting for a BRAF mutation to make a decision about a pill treatment versus immunotherapy, if it arose on the head, we found that it was a little less likely to be related. So only 15% of BRAF mutation, V600 mutant tumors arose on the head, which was a lot less often than the overall rate of 25% in this cohort. On the other hand, on the scalp, the most common one was enriched, was an NF1 mutation. So that's kind of interesting. I keep that in the back of my mind when someone tells me where their melanoma started. You know, I already have an idea now what kind of mutation they might have. And then here is what's called the tumor mutational burden. And here you can sort of see each little circle is a tumor, and the middle line here, I'm not sure if you can see that well, but the middle line is the median, or the sort of middle number, and the width of the bar is just the distribution of it. So you can see that the head has the most mutations on average, and that the lower extremity in trunk have sort of fewer mutations on average. The average was 35 versus like 10 or 11. And I'll just tell you that the difference between 10 and 35 is enormous when it comes to sort of immunotherapy success. So right off the bat, we had this idea that if you have a nice thinning hair head like I do, and you had a melanoma there, unfortunately, it's probably more sun exposed, probably has a lot more mutations in it. And we already knew that more mutations is probably actually a better thing for immunotherapy success. The other thing we saw here is, and we plotted this, we plotted the mutations on this side by gene, and we saw that BRAF mutations, just like I showed you, if you had a V600E, you have fewer other mutations, whereas if you had, KIT or NF1, you had a lot of other mutations, an average of 37 or 43 per megabase. So that's a big difference, and this is something I think people didn't really appreciate in melanoma, that the primary site, even just knowing where it started from, could give you that information. The other kind of fun thing I'll just briefly mention is that when we plot it with this very gender normative, I apologize, sort of look by male or female, so the male sex was in blue and female sex was in red, pink. On average, advanced melanoma happens about 2/3 men and 1/3 women. That's kind of the sort of normal distribution over decades. And you see here that the only site that actually had a few more women than men was actually the legs, which, I thought was a little kind of, nice and expected because of how often women's legs see the sun, whereas men typically don't get it as exposed. Whereas the head, the scalp, is much more common in men, about 80%, compared to the 2/3 average. And so we also showed other details, like the older you are, the higher your average number of mutations is. Kind of goes with this idea that you accumulate mutations with age. And that's probably the only important thing on this slide. So this is probably the key slide when we link, do we need to know about mutations and outcomes to immunotherapy? So we actually collapsed into 4 groups, and we said these are not quite the same 4 groups as the Cancer Genome Atlas. We said BRAF V600, whether that's V600E or V600K, that's in blue, and we said NRAS, that's its own group, NRAS Q61, and the NF1 is its own group, and then we collapsed everything else into the other group. So there's only four choices here. And I think 4 is a nice doable number for a clinician to remember, and this is mutually exclusive. So you either have a BRAF, an NF1, an NRAS, or your other. And here on the y-axis is everyone starts out at the top doing okay, and then as they have growth in their tumor, the person comes off the chart and the number drops. And so here you see that the blue and red kind of do worse, and those are the BRAF, V600, and NRAS. This is to single agent immunotherapy with either nivolumab or pembrolizumab. In contrast, you see a similar trend, but everything kind of more smushed together when you do nivolumab plus ipilimumab. And so the key take home here is it looks like the NRAS still do a little bit worse. This is tumor growth, not survival, but the trends look similar with overall survival. So the tumors are more likely to grow if they're NRAS mutant, especially with a single agent. But the BRAF looks like it's quite a bit better when you add the ipilimumab to nivolumab. Now, these were not done in a randomized way. This is not a direct comparison by any means, but it's an interesting sort of idea that no one else had really shown or thought of before. NF1 seems to do quite a bit better, which makes sense. They're concentrated in areas with a lot of sun exposure, like on the scalp. They arise in older patients that tend to have lived a lot more years and gotten a lot more sort of wear and tear in their melanomas. So even just knowing the single gene, information kind of gives you this idea of how they might do on immunotherapy. And so the next big question is, well, Shushara, you told me that mutational burden, the number of mutations matters. You told me that, the primary site is associated with that. You told me that the driver grouping or driver class is associated with that. So really, what's important? If you tell me 8 things are important, it's hard to remember everything. And so we do what's called a multivariate analysis, where our statisticians sort of helped us and collapsed it down into multiple things from like around a dozen variables, and said these are the ones that seem to pop out as the most important. So for single agent, nivolumab or pembrolizumab, whenever we chose to give that to our patients, the factors that seemed to be associated with outcomes was how did they feel? So that's huge, right? I can't tell that from genetics. I can't tell that from a scan. I can only tell that from seeing you and talking to you. And that's still very, very important. Where are your tumors? That's the metastatic stage. So it turns out that having lung-only metastases or lung or lymph node only is better than having even just lymph node only. It seems to be for some reason. And I find that fascinating. We're still working on trying to understand that. But other metastatic sites like the brain, which is M1D, does a little bit worse. You're more likely to have progression. And that kind of makes sense. The driver class we thought was very interesting, that it still popped out as important, even when incorporated how they felt, where their mutations were, and how many mutations were in the tumor. And that, to me, is probably the key novelty, that it still seems to matter what your genetic driver is, even if you know how you feel, where your disease is, and how many mutations are in the tumor. If you don't have access to all that fancy information, which a lot of people don't have, there's still some cool, inferences that we could get. So if your melanoma started from the head, it seems to be less likely to have progression on single agent drug than if it arose somewhere else. And then with the 2-drug combination, it didn't seem to matter as much. So the last part of this, and I apologize, I'm probably horrifically over, how often does it really matter? Let's say immunotherapy works, then Alex, you can argue, I didn't really need to know all that. And certainly hundreds of patients, thousands of people around the world have been, as Dr. Nair said, very likely cured with immunotherapy and sometimes with targeted therapy to BRAF/MEK, with BRAF/MEK inhibitors. And we didn't really know all this fancy other stuff. So one of the things I wanted to show the rest of the melanoma community was how often was knowing the MSK-IMPACT sort of, status, how often did that actually help someone? And no one had really quantified that. I think you can always ask a physician, say, have you seen someone benefit from getting a fancy genetics panel? And I would say, oh yeah, we see it occasionally, but we wanted to really sort of put it down in numbers and quantify how often it could be helpful, because I use this information now when I talk to patients looking for genetic options after immunotherapy. So we only treated out of around 172 patients that needed more treatment after the 2 known immunotherapies. The immunotherapies you can use no matter what the genetics are, right? And I didn't want to include BRAF V600 because you don't need a fancy genetic panel. We've been testing for that as a melanoma community since 2011. and even before that in clinical trials. So I looked at those that didn't have the BRAF V600 mutation that needed more therapy, and it was 172 patients, and only 27 were matched up. So that tells us right off the bat, we need more options, because some of the best clinicians in the world that I work with decided, hey, I got the genetic result, but there's nothing I could do with it that's specific to that genetic result. It was only about 1 in 6 people that we actually tried something specific to their genetics. And so these are some of the examples, but I'll walk you through some of the more dramatic ones. And so this is what's called a swimmer plot. Each patient is on the y-axis going across. And you want to see arrows continuing. That's a good thing. If they just stop, that means we had to stop the treatment. And here you can see it's months going along. So this is 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. This is all after immunotherapy. So time 0 was after immunotherapy. So you can see our shining star is someone that's been out now over 3 years, and I'll show you that scan. There's some other really successful sort of targeted anecdotes. And so this is the same progression chart, but it's for the 27 patients we treated. And so you can see I'm not proud of the ski slope, part of this. Plenty of people just didn't have it work, but I am proud that it doesn't go to 0, that some people are out, multiple years. And so this was our most dramatic case. This is someone who had melanoma that went to the small bowel, had progression of disease or growth on the combination immunotherapy. We removed the small bowel, found this genetic fusion. This one gene was fused to another gene. And you can see the tumor here in the center, lymph node in the middle of the chest. After just 9 weeks, had dramatic shrinkage. This person actually, we wanted to be doubly sure, actually removed those lymph nodes and determined under the microscope they were all dead, and remains, no evidence of disease. I think the survivorship community all knows this term. So remains NED. This says 6 months because this is an old slide. They're actually off all therapy from the surgery over 2.5 years now, almost 3 years, and over 3 years when you think about it from the beginning of the crizotinib. So really a dramatic result. This was another one, a patient who had a terrible bone progression. And I circle 1 bone metastasis here, and liver metastasis after ipi-nivo, and really quickly had a really beautiful response to trametinib. Actually, this patient died of another cause unrelated to melanoma, did not have a melanoma recurrence. So how often does it actually help? Well, it depends on who you're selecting. And this is kind of the last bit leading to the end of the talk. If you know nothing else, we really helped 8 people in the end. 8 people had something stable for 6 months or more after immunotherapy. So I'm not saying 8 people overall, but I'm saying immunotherapy didn't work. How often did knowing the genetics without BRAF V600 help? And if you know nothing else, it's only about 1 in 100. But of course, we're physicians, you're smart patients, we work together, and we do know other things. So we know your genetic type. We don't have to screen everybody with this. We can wait until immunotherapy isn't working and actually get that number down to about 1 in 21 people. So if we only screen the people that progress on immunotherapy, and if you only know the 1 gene to start, the BRAF V600, that's fine. Then you only have to screen 21 people. And I want to get that number down. I want to get it down to 2. I want to get it down as close to 1 as possible. And one of the biggest unmet needs in our community by the genetics, I would say NRAS and NF1, if they don't respond to checkpoint inhibitors, we really don't have a lot of great targeted options for them. And then BRAF V600, I didn't give them much love in this talk, because BRAF MEK can work quite well, but we all know cases where it doesn't work or it stops working. And we're working on clinical trials, with novel combinations trying to improve on that large group of unmet need. So probably the most interesting one, this is from an MSK press release, so this is all public information. This is a patient of mine, where of this group of about 700 people, there were 8 that had a totally different other cancer, that the genetics actually changed the diagnosis completely and said, you know what, that looks like mutations from ultraviolet sunlight. The geneticist can sort of tell that, and say, consider melanoma. And when you tell someone with sarcoma, as my patient Lynn had, if you tell them you have sarcoma and then you say, wait a minute, it's actually melanoma, it's a great thing actually, because there are more options in melanoma than in sarcoma for the most part. And so she had a dramatic, shrinkage and response to Opdivo and Yervoy, or Nivo and Ipi. We had 2 complete responses out of those 8 people. So it's been really gratifying to cherry pick those cases of other tumors and give them a really nice response. And so I'll sort of skip past and say, I hope I've convinced you that we can use this genetic information in the clinic to sort of give you a better idea if we're doing well or not. And then we can rarely target them quite well. We have a long, long way to go, but I think this is an important first step. And so for you guys, for those that are in survivorship or that have loved ones maybe that haven't done well, I see you, I hear you, I appreciate you. I think what is the next 1 to 2 years hold? I think we're definitely, the information age is here to stay. I think medicine in some ways is woefully behind in terms of sharing access to information and stuff. I think this shared information is mostly a good thing, almost always a good thing. Not always, but almost always. And I think we're going to have more sort of dedicated survivorship clinics, because no one really knows what the long-term, outcomes are for activating your inflammatory response to kill the melanoma. So many other things, heart attacks and strokes and stuff, we've spent 40 years preventing inflammation. Obesity is about preventing inflammation. So if we promote it for a good reason, that's great, and you survive a deadly disease. I think we're now moving to that next chapter. How do we care for you guys better? How do we watch in the long run for heart disease, for example? I'm just extrapolating and stipulating. I have no proof of any of this. It's just where my mind is headed. I think we're probably going to have more choices with immunotherapy. We're going to sort of be more precise about it. I think we might get to the point in the next couple of years where we are more often sort of aware of specific immunotherapy toxicity risks. Maybe we have more genotype information or something about your own immune system ahead of time. And, cancer vaccines and more personalized immunotherapy, I think maybe around the corner. It's certainly going to come in the next 5 years. And I don't think, the one thing I could say is I don't think we're going to get a one-size-fits-all improvement on the status quo all at once in the next couple of years, the way that PD-1 blockade really changed melanoma. And so it's really been a privilege and a joy to be around during that generational, once in a generation change. But I think it's onward and upward, and I really appreciate your attention, and I apologize for, I'm sure, going woefully over.
No, I feel, Dr. Shastari, like I speak for everyone, that you took exactly as much time as you needed to. It was really great information. Thank you so much for that. And at this time, we would love to take your questions if you have any for Dr. Shastari. I've got a couple of in the queue already, but if you have a question, you can type it into the chat box on the right side of your screen and make sure that you select to send it to all panelists so that we can see them. So the first one for you, Dr. Shastari, is from an attendee. Do you see more aggressive melanomas in younger patients compared to older patients?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've thought about it myself. I think that we have growing data to show, what what this had shown. which is, the average number of mutations kind of goes up over time in melanomas that arise in people. So um, there are always exceptions, but on average, that 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old patient's going to have fewer mutations than a 60, 70-year-old, 80-year-old. And we just know that the trick that we've sort of mastered so far, blocking PD-1, blocking CTLA-4, that's just one or two tricks in the immune system's arsenal. And I agree that it feels like a young person's melanoma doesn't rely on cloaking itself in PD-L1, doesn't rely as much, on those sorts of tricks that nivolumab and pembrolizumab will just quickly get rid of. There are exceptions. Some young people do really well, but I agree with you. I think when we think of aggressiveness right now, I think of, does immunotherapy work? Do we have a targeted, option ready to go that's going to, shoot for the moon, shoot for a clear scan? And it seems like more often we're seeing the clear scans in sort of middle age and above patients than we are seeing in the really younger patients. I think that has something to do with the genetics here.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question from a different attendee for you. I've seen recent research about the connection between microbiome and the success of immunotherapy. Can you talk to this correlation and whether changes to the patient's gut microbiome make the patient more responsive to immunotherapy?
So I think it's fascinating. I've been I'm not a major player in that subfield, but I am participating in a microbiome trial in that way. Really cool. And so what we know is that our grandparents were right. You are what you eat, and to some extent. What's kind of interesting is that it's not always what you think. So one of the groups that's very involved in this, there's a few out there, and all of us are working on it, but our MD Anderson colleagues in Houston had asked their patients, what do you eat, what's your diet, and do you take supplements and stuff like that? And this was a routine thing they asked all their stage 4 melanoma patients that were getting immunotherapy, and they found to their surprise that people who said, I take a probiotic supplement, happened to actually do a little bit worse with immunotherapy outcomes than those who did not take a probiotic. And so there's a lot to that, and we don't really know, that it's causative. We don't know that just because it's correlated that one causes the other. But it does show us that, like, what we think of as a healthy thing doesn't always mean it's the right move for that exact scenario. But it is exciting because the more we understand the gut bacteria and how they influence our immune system, I think the closer we are getting to actually manipulating it quite well. And so we're doing, I think, the next obvious thing, which is taking, processed sort of, cleaner sort of stool product from people who actually either did well to immunotherapy, which a group from Israel recently published on, or healthy volunteers, colleagues from Pittsburgh. If I'm not mistaken, I might be messing that up. I can't remember who did what, but colleagues from Pittsburgh, colleagues from Israel, both recently published great sort of data in a journal called Science, and they said we took patients whose melanomas grew on PD-1 blockade, on immunotherapy, and then they sort of carefully gave them an antibiotic, kind of cleaned out some of their gut bacteria. They give them that sort of, stool product from donors, and it's kind of simplistic idea, but you say, if that person did well, let's take their gut bacteria, put it in you that isn't doing as well, and let's see if we rescue, what your immune system can do, give it a boost that way. And to, frankly, my, surprise, it's already sort of working, I think, in some people. And I think that's just the very crudest initial attempt. And where this goes, I'm sorry, this is a long answer. The next obvious answer is, well, what can I do, right? Because it's one thing to hear about an isolated, clinical trial, a few patients here or there. people say, what can I do to boost my gut bacteria? And the best thing that we know of is that a more diverse gut bacteria tends to be a healthier one in general. And so I tell my patients, don't just, stick to one bacteria and say that's the good one, because odds are we're going to pick the wrong one. We've been wrong far more than we've been right. So I tell patients, plant-based diets, things that we know are good for us are probably a good thing. But unless we're doing that for years and years and years, it's hard to really shift your microbiome unless a scientist or someone's really doing it carefully. And trust me, it takes careful antibiotics, then careful infusion of massive amounts of bacteria to change it overnight. It's otherwise kind of stubborn. And I think of that in terms of what we know. A good healthy diet, it takes a year. It takes years to sort of manifest into health. And so I think we're just scratching the surface. It's super exciting.
That is really interesting. So we'll continue on. I've got one more question for you, and I think we'll probably make this the last one. This one actually comes from Dr. Nair, so it's a colleague to colleague, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I mess up the acronyms here. But Dr. Nair says, thanks for this great work and the paper in Clinical Cancer Research from April 2021 with one of the largest melanoma databases with modern treatments. Do you think BRAF plus TERT promoter, I'm probably doing that wrong, co-mutation makes a difference in durability of response to BRAF inhibitors in your database? Please first correct me if I got any of that incorrect.
Dr. Nair, I don't know. We should look at it. So he's asking about a specific mutation. It's actually the single most common mutation is not any of the ones that I mentioned. It's this a mutation in a telomerase gene, which is keeping the chromosomes artificially sort of young, which a cancer sort of takes advantage of to sort of, I guess, keep up with the amount of replications it needs to do its nefarious things. So that's actually the most common mutation in skin melanomas. And Dr. Nair is asking if having it versus not having it makes a difference in success of targeted therapy. And I actually don't know the answer to that, but it's an answer we could pretty easily answer, and we should collaborate on that.
All right, well, challenge hopefully accepted. Gauntlet is seemingly thrown here. All right, so thank you so much for all of this really great information, Dr. Chustari. Wonderful insight, and thank you everyone as well for the questions that you put in. We are going to up next welcome in Mariah Valet. She's a melanoma survivor who received her treatment and care at Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute, and Mariah is going to share with us a presentation from the patient and the survivor perspective. Mariah?
Thank you so much, Katie. And I just want to thank the other speakers. Thank you, Dr. Nair, and thank you, Dr. Chustari. You guys did wonderful. I want to start off by saying that I just feel so privileged that I was asked to speak today. Again, my name is Mariah. I'm a melanoma stage 3 survivor. I'm also a mother of 2 wonderful children and a psychotherapist. I want to thank all the members of the audience, for everyone who registered and tuned in today. It would be wonderful for everyone to be in person. I would just love to feel the energy in the room today. But this is, the next best thing. And like Dr. Nair said, hopefully next year we'll all be in person celebrating together. So I'll talk to you guys a little bit about my first melanoma survivors event that I went to. This one's now my 4th one, actually. I'm 3 years out from my original diagnosis. But my first melanoma survivors event, the name has changed over the years. Sometimes it's like a survivorship gala. This year it's Advances in Melanoma Care. We're all doing the same thing, celebrating the research, the medical teams, the providers that make it all possible for us to be here today and to be able to call ourselves survivors. So my first melanoma survivorship event was at Lehigh Valley Health, and I worked the Cedar Crest location. And I went in, and I was about to deliver my 2nd child about a month later. And I walk up to the registration table, and there was a bunch of lovely ladies checking everyone in. And they said, "Are you a survivor?" And I didn't know. And at that time because I was yet to start treatment. I hadn't started treatment at that time yet. So for everyone that's here today and is either in treatment or awaiting to start treatment, I just want you guys all to know that you wouldn't be here today if you weren't a survivor. So I just wish that we were all together so that we could have a round of applause to celebrate everyone that's made it today and for all the people that made it possible. So with that said, I wanted to personally thank a couple providers that really deeply touched my life, and I'm sure has touched so many people's lives, not only the patients, but the loved ones, people who are here watching today. So Angela Miller, thank you so much. I'll talk a little bit more about our relationship later. Dr. Suresh Nair, I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for being not only the amazing oncologist that you are, but the wonderful person who you are. Dr. Chet Nayak, who was given the very difficult task of delivering the news to me about how serious my melanoma was. And Dr. Wojcik, who did a wonderful job putting me all back together at the end. So before I get, so my story, we're going to talk about my story today, but it's not just about my story. It's about all of us here and what connects us. And that all of us, our lives have been touched by cancer, whether you're a patient, a provider, or a loved one. And, you know, being touched by cancer means something different for all of us. And the feelings, especially as patients or as family members, the way that we feel about our diagnoses sometimes change over time. You might feel in shock, denial. You might feel like you're a victim, and why wouldn't you? It's a horrible thing to be tasked with and to have to face. But it's an opportunity. It's a true opportunity to demonstrate strength, courage, and bravery in the face of adversity. So at times, like I said, we might feel bad for ourselves, and I think it's okay to feel exactly what it is that you're feeling, and like I said, address, take on this hard thing to look at, cancer, this ugly, scary word, but to face it head on, and to not necessarily always carry ourselves like victims, because carrying yourself like a victim doesn't get you to survivorship, and that's what we're here today to celebrate. What leads you to survivorship is hopefulness, trust in your medical team, their recommendations, optimism, and relentless belief that you will get through your journey. And it truly, truly is a journey. Cancer provides a unique opportunity to face your mortality and to decide what and who are the most important things in your life. And it's not ignoring the feelings, it's not ignoring your fear or your grief, it's embracing them as part of your journey. I can't say, of course, I think that we could all agree that we wouldn't have chosen this diagnosis. But although it wasn't a choice, I grew in ways that I could never expect. I learned more about self-care, self-love, and how to take care of my body even when I felt betrayed by it. In terms of, you know, facing mortality and what that means, it makes us realize the fragility of life and how valuable time is, and especially the present. So I've avoided talking about my story long enough, so let me get into it. It's never an easy one to tell for me, despite how many times I've told it. So my husband and I found out that I had cancer when I was 22 weeks pregnant with our daughter. And actually, I think right now would be a really good time. Is she out there? For me to introduce you guys, to show you and to thank my medical team for getting me to where I am today, to where I have this beautiful, happy, healthy daughter. My other little one just popped his head in. And this is, the happiest part of survivorship, being able to
Mommy?
be present and enjoy my family and be a parent. Go ahead. I gotta talk a little bit more. Go ahead. Thank you guys. You did great. And thank you to my husband, my wonderful assistant that's helping me with the children. So I was 22 weeks pregnant, and I don't know about you guys, I don't know about the rest of the patients here, family members, but it really became clear to me how serious my diagnosis was when they were like, okay, this is the lesion, this is the depth of the lesion, which I really didn't understand what that meant at that point. But I kind of figured out it was serious when they scheduled a multidisciplinary conference and let me know that I would be meeting with like 4 to 5 different providers in one day, and that it was going to be basically immediate, like a week after we got the biopsy results. My cancer started as a mole here on my forehead that I had since I was a teenager. It started mutating when I was pregnant. That's when I noticed it growing and changing, and it was actually one of my sisters who's watching today. Hi, Elizabeth. Who really encouraged me to get it checked out. So thank you to her. And so we've all been to this multidisciplinary conference, right, where we talk with each of the doctors and they explain to us kind of what's going on and what our treatment options are and what the next steps are. And I think that's when it became very clear to my husband and I how serious the diagnosis was. So like many of you know, the original site, when there is an original site located, like Dr. Shusari mentioned, there isn't always an original site located. Sometimes the cancer can be found when it has already metastasized to another area of the body. But so my original site, the lesion was 4 millimeters deep. So they measure melanoma and prognosis and chance of recurrence based off of the depth of the original lesion. So mine was what they considered a 4 out of 5, so pretty serious. Dr. Nayak, who is very dear to my heart, again, had the very difficult task of explaining to us how serious it was. And I remember asking him, the same kind of questions that we all want answered, like, am I gonna make it? And this is prior to starting treatment. And he just looked at us and he said, this is a problem. And so it's a testament of the medical team, the research, and everything that it took to actually get me here today, because at one point we really didn't know. Dr. Shusari talked a lot about different genetic mutations, and I'm one of the cancer patients who is actually BRAF positive. So it is a genetic mutation. It's not something I inherited. It's something that this UV hit my my lesion and mutated the UV rays. So for me, and I think for a lot of other survivors, sometimes this isn't our only health condition. And that was something that made my treatment even more difficult, because so not only am I pregnant, 22 weeks pregnant, now I have melanoma, and we found out that it spread to my lymph nodes. We weren't sure if it had possibly spread anywhere else. And I was BRAF positive, which is one of the rare melanomas that can spread through your blood, can spread to other organs. And again, Dr. Nayak was the one who had to break the news to us that it could possibly spread to my daughter. That obviously didn't happen. That's why I brought her in right at the beginning to let everyone know that she's a very healthy, happy, beautiful young girl. And I'm just, so thankful to everyone that she's here today. So I am one of those people that Dr. Shusari was talking about that really benefited from the targeted BRAF MEK inhibitors. So I did Tafinlar and Mechanis. Those were the two medicines that I were on, targeted medicines that I were on, that brought me to where I am today, which is 3 years from my original diagnosis, and all my most recent scans are NED, no evidence of disease. And that's like, the best news that a survivor can hear. And it's hard. It's hard waiting on those biopsy results. It's scary. There was many biopsies that we waited on, and I can think of there was a false positive at one time of something that came up, and waiting on that to be scanned and what the scan would come back and say, and then for it to be biopsied and what the biopsy would reveal, and the further testing on it and what that would reveal. And I can just remember, like, waiting on biopsy results over Thanksgiving, over Christmas, over birthdays and anniversaries, and how the stress, how stressful that was, and what a relief it was every time that we got good news. So, bringing it back to what we all have in common here today is the strength, courage, and the flexibility that anyone with cancer sort of has to muster up within themselves in order to carry on. So something that I did in the beginning of, after I delivered and she was healthy, and then I was able to begin treatment, I kept myself very busy. I decided I was going to become an acrobat, picked that up, did a competition in that, had a great time. I started my own nonprofit doing, counseling, which is work that I've been doing for about 10 years. And people saw what I was doing. Oh, something else, I picked up Reiki. I became a Reiki practitioner. And people saw what I was doing, and I was very often rewarded for, what they saw as strength. And that was like the first year of my journey. And as I'm getting further out, and some of you, your journey might be much longer than mine, and some of you might have just been diagnosed. But for me now, I'm 3 years out, and I'm at a little bit of a different place where I am trying to not be as busy, and instead, be more introspective, and to allow myself to feel the difficult emotions that come along with cancer. That doesn't stop me from being, eternally optimistic, but it allows me to feel and to be honest with the people around me about how I'm feeling, and to know that it's okay to not feel strong sometimes, and that it's okay to feel sadness and to feel grief, to grieve the life that you thought you were going to have, or impending grief, or worried about, again, our mortality. These are all normal reactions to what we're going through. And so I'm at a place now where cancer has taught me it's okay to slow down, and you don't have to be busy all the time to run away from the things that scare you in your life. And that courage and bravery is taking a really close look at the things that scare you, and leaning into them and persisting even when you feel deeply that you want to resist. I haven't really kept track of time. I think I got the majority of the things I wanted to say out. I do definitely want to thank my treatment team again. So if you guys are new here, you are in good hands. Again, I mentioned earlier that, I'm probably not the only patient here that is dealing with multiple health issues. And the treatment team at Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute they treat you like a whole person. They don't treat you as a diagnosis. And yes, they work very hard to narrow down exactly what's going on with you, to provide you with the best medical, procedures and medication, of course. But they don't just treat you as your diagnosis. they care about how you're feeling, about how you're doing. Angela Miller would, you know, offer to talk to me at any time about anything. You know, she was there for me like a family member. Dr. Suresh Nair, I felt like he treated me like as if I was his sister or his daughter. Dr. Wojcik, Dr. Nyack, these people, they just circle around you and make sure that they're doing everything that they can to care for you, and not just as providers, but as people. And I think that is something that makes the Cancer Institute and this particular treatment team so special. Like, not only are they world leaders in melanoma treatment and research, but they're incredible people that are warm and that truly are you know, fighting for the best for all of us. You know, they certainly provide individualized care on a very case-by-case basis. I did want to, I think I missed thanking everyone, the dozens and dozens and dozens of doctors from Memorial Sloan Kettering that weighed in on my case. I know Dr. Nair and the treatment team at Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute again had a tricky case with me. I also have an autoimmune disease, so I wasn't the best candidate for immunotherapy, which, like Dr. Shustari said, a lot of times these cancers are treated solely with immunotherapy, and that's great. That's wonderful. It helps so many people. And unfortunately, I was not a candidate for it. So while being BRAF positive meant that my cancer could spread through my blood, and that's scary, it also meant that I was a candidate for the targeted medications, the mechanism inhibitors that Dr. Shustari had mentioned. So I think that I said everything that I wrote down. Cancer is something that doesn't just affect the patient. It affects you know, the entire family. It, you know, my mom, who is watching from like 1,000 miles away, I can't imagine how difficult it could be to be a mother and to see your children go through something like this. She's definitely a major source of support for me, as well as a lot of people, but as well as my father-in-law, who I know is also watching. Just an amazing support to me. And these are some of the people that I drew the most strength from in order to be where I'm at today. So with that said, it looks like I see some stuff in the chat. Thank you for sharing your story. Do you want to read those, Katie?
Yeah, sure. I just have to say that, I mean, thank you so much for sharing with us, Mariah. That's my eyes were tearing up. I'm sure a lot of people's eyes were tearing up. You've got such a beautiful family. We're all so happy that you're doing so well, that the little ones are all good. So I'm just sending the biggest positive and heartfelt vibes to you, and I know everybody else's as well. Yeah, I'll field these questions to you if that's okay. We are going to take some time right now. If you've got any additional questions for Mariah, we've got a few in the queue right here, but just pop it in the chat and you can send it to all panelists so that I can see them and make sure that we don't miss anything. All right, so Mariah, the first one, as you said, coming in from one of the attendees, she's so grateful that you're sharing your story and wondering if you can recommend any support groups that you and your family and or your family members used, or anything that you're aware of in that regard.
So it's a great question. At the last gala that we had in person, there was some survivors getting together who wanted to start a support group for, you know, the Lehigh Valley Cancer Institute melanoma survivors. And with COVID and things like that, it sort of got backed up. So to be perfectly honest with you, neither I nor my family attended support groups during my journey.
Okay. All right, this one coming in, let's see here. Well, another thank you so much on behalf of all the survivors and just the great work that you're doing with your nonprofit. And just, this is actually from Dr. Nair saying you're an inspiration to everyone. It's so evident the bond that you have with the medical team you worked with. And just another congrats to all the survivors from Dr. Nair. We'll leave it open for another hot second. If anybody does have any other questions, we'll give it just a little bit of time here. I mean, I know we are coming up on what we had at least said was going to be the official wrap time on the event, so our timing is actually working out really well here. But while we wait, if there are any additional questions, obviously we've had some extremely insightful information here this evening and adding real hope for survivorship here, where we can hear stories like Mariah's and what that journey looks like. So let's see, I don't believe we've got any additional questions. So with that, this does conclude our program. I want to say a few thank yous to Dr. Nair, of course, as well as our speakers, Dr. Shustari and Mariah Valet, for taking the time to deliver these presentations this evening and bring some uplifting information and messaging to the rest of us. And thank you to all of you for attending this, our first virtual melanoma survivorship event. Another huge thank you as well to NJM Insurance Group for its sponsorship of the event. Just a quick reminder for you, when you exit the program, a very brief survey is going to pop up on your screen. We would be so grateful if you would take a couple of minutes to fill that out. And one final surprise, everyone is going to be receiving a small gift in the mail just as a thank you for attending the event this evening. It's this mask. It's got all of the different colors of the cancer survivorship ribbons on it. So really, really nice little gift with form as well as function. So you can watch for that in the mail. Watch for the survey once we sign off here. And thank you again so much for joining us here this evening. Be well, everyone.